In this video, we're going to try a new authentication service called Kinde to protect our NextJs 13 app. I'm going to walk you through the documentation step by step from creating an account to implementing it inside the app router in NextJs 13. They've also been kind enough to sponsor this video, so thank you to the Kinde team, and now let's get started. So first things first, you need to create an account. You can go to kinde.com, just note that there is an E at the end of Kinde, from where you can just hit this start for free button to create a free account. This is going to take you through an onboarding flow where you can define the business name or a custom subdomain that you want to use on kinde.com's domain for your authentication purposes. And then once you finish that step, you're going to end up on a dashboard like you can see here. Up top, I can see my business name. There's different environments that you can create. For example, I have a production environment and also a development environment. This can differ from the URLs that you need to redirect or authorize Kinde to redirect the users after they log in or log out. So we're going to use a production environment in this example, but you can have as many environments as you want for staging, development, and production. Now, let's just quickly walk through these different options inside of our panel. The first tab is for your users. This is where you can manage the users. These are people who have logged into your application using the Kinde authentication. I currently have one user. The next one is organizations. If you don't create one, it just defaults to one default organization, but it allows you to have multiple organizations, and this will be useful if your app is a multi-tenant app where, for example, you're selling this service to different businesses, and you would then create different organizations, and then these organizations can have their own users log into their own account, and it will be separated from other organizations or tenants inside of just one single app. In this example, we're just going to use one. Now, the design is where you can customize the look and feel of different pages and emails sent to your users. We're going to leave them at the default here. Now, billing is a feature that they're currently working on where you would be able to define plans, manage subscriptions, or set pricing options for your users and connect to payment gateways. We're not going to touch on this today, but it is something that we can dive into it later once this is a feature that we can actually use. Another beta feature is releases or feature flags, which you can define per user, so they would see different features depending on what you've defined inside of your user dashboard. So feature flags is something that I would definitely come back in maybe in a second video or a part 2 video to see how we can implement feature flags to show different versions of our website to different users and kind of track their behavior there. Now, the next tab is the settings. This is where we would just configure our settings for our authentication. Here we have the primary details of our business. This is what you provided when you were creating an account. You can go ahead and provide more information here. You can also look at different options that you have. What we're interested or what we're going to discuss in this video is more so underneath this environment. This is where we would define different applications or authentication methods and set up our app to work. So on the detail, as you can see, we're defining our production, deciding what we want or not to allow. If we want to have tracking through Google Analytics that we can provide over here. In the custom domains, you can provide your own custom domain. So instead of using kinde.com or your subdomain .kinde.com, you can just provide your own custom domain over here to use that instead. Now, authentication is where we would define different authentication providers that our applications that we would define under this tab is going to have access to. So under the applications, let me just show you this. It comes out of the box with a backend app and a front-end app. For our NextJs 13 using the app router, we're going to set it up using the backend app because everything is going to be server rendered. Now, inside of this application, you can see that you can define what language or framework you're using. It's going to give you a nice little link to the documentation. You would also receive the information that you would need to set up inside your environment variables in your NextJs app. We're going to walk through these steps shortly, but this is where you would get all of those information. Now inside of this application, this backend app, I can go to the authentication tab and decide which of the providers that we have defined in our settings under this authentication. So the first tab, I'm defining all of the authentication providers that I want my applications to have access to. So I've only turned on Google here. Maybe I want to add another connection. Let's say I want to also add Facebook. Now, all the applications that I define here would have access to enable Facebook login. So we're going to go to the application tab inside of our backend app. Now, under the authentication tab specific to this application, we can see it is using the passwordless email authentication, and this Facebook wasn't there. It's just added because I added this to the authentication tab under the settings. I'm only using Google, but you can just turn it on. In some apps, you may want to use specific type of providers. In the others, you might want to limit the ones that you're providing. So you can just toggle them on and off. Now going back to our settings, we have our APIs. You can also enable multi-factor authentication. You can use an authenticator app, email, or SMS, which is great. We're not going to do this in this video, but if you're interested in also seeing these features or any other feature that you are interested, please leave them down in the comments. It helps me knowing what should I include in a part 2, if at all, for our Kind application. What I'm thinking is multi-factor authentication, maybe implementing feature flags where we can show different versions of our site to different users. Also, role-based authentication where some users, depending on their role, have access to different functions, maybe to create or to delete resources. So if there's anything other than this that you're interested into seeing, please leave them in the comments so I can include them in the part 2 video. Now moving on, we have this event hooks. These are web hooks that you can trigger depending on different events happening inside your clerk. And the last one is feature flags, which we just touched on. Now going back to the Kind site, if you go to resources and documentation, you can see they provide different SDKs depending on the framework that you're using. Today we're using NextJs. And in the NextJS SDKs, there's 2 versions. One is the app router, the other one is the pages router. Now, we're using the app router in this project, so we're going to continue with the app router SDK. But before going ahead, I just want to mention something. The Kind team has actually put together a starter kit template that you can use. So this is a blog post they had for when they actually released the NextJS 13 SDK. I'm going to link this article in the description so you can read through it. You can have access to the SDK, to the repository, and also there is this starter kit that you can use. I have actually extended this starter kit to create the project for our own video today. I'm going to explain what I've changed and whatnot, but you can use this starter kit as a template to clone it inside your own repository, and instead of starting from scratch, you would have a starting point. I've also cloned this repository, but I've changed it to use Tailwind because they're not. And I've also moved around their components to make it the way that I usually create my app. So we're going to jump into the code to see that in action. But going back to our docs for the SDK, the first thing that you would want to do if you're not using the SDK is to install this package. This is obviously installed in that starter kit. So if you're using the starter kit, you don't need to install this. But if you want to build from scratch after creating a NextJS 13 app, you can just create this or install this SDK. Now, inside of your application, in your dashboard, you have to go under settings and applications and find your app. And under the details, you have to define these 2 callback URLs. So one is allowed callback URLs, which is the API auth kind callback, and also allowed logout redirect URLs. This is just an allow list so that Kind knows to which URLs it is allowed to redirect the users. So going back, let me just show you where these are. So if you go back inside of your settings, inside of your application, if you click on this application, as you can see down here, these callback URLs, the allowed callback URL and also the the allowed logout redirect URL is set to localhost because we are in development. Well, if you want to have two different environments, as I mentioned in the beginning, you can have one for production, which is pointing to the domain of your production deployment. And for development, you can have it to point to localhost. I'm using localhost and one environment here, but you get the idea. So going back here, second step is actually setting up some environment variables. So inside of your app, there's this .env.local.sample that I've created, or it comes with that starter kit, better I can say. And the three things that you need to set is your client ID, client secret, and issuer URL, and also your site URL, and this is the logout redirect URL and login redirect URL, where you would want to redirect the users after they log in. For example, in this case, we're going to dashboard, and where do you want to send them after they log out? They go back to the home page, and what is the primary site URL, and also this information. So going back to our dashboard again, you can find the domain. This is the issuer. And as part of the sign-in flow, or when you created an account the first time, it allows you to select the subdomains. For me is hamed.kind.com, and this is going to be your issuer URL. And then you have your client ID, which is going to go to client ID, and then a client secret. This needs to be inside an environment variable, and you should not expose this to the client side. The client ID can go to the client side or the front end of your application, but the client secret should always remain on the server. Now going back to the next step is to set up an API endpoint. So inside of our app, let me just save this and close that up. So inside of this is using the source directory because the starter kit was using the source directory, and I just expanded on it. So I'm also using source directory. Inside of the app, we have this API auth, and inside of it, there's this kind auth inside square brackets. So this is a dynamic route or a dynamic path. And inside of it, there's this route.ts. And all you need to do here is to just get this handle auth from the SDK that you installed, and then return this get function or get method that is going to return this handle auth, passing the specific endpoint that the user is trying to access. This is going to dynamically expose a bunch of APIs for you to log in and log out and register the users. And this is why we're handling it like so. Now, the next step to integrate this with your app is to actually use this log in link and register links inside of your application. These are links that are going to redirect the user to the specific API endpoint, which is then going to show them the correct kind page to sign in or register. And for logging out the user, you can just use this log out link, which is, we're going to see this in a second inside of our application. And as you can see here, it's just showing some examples for actually fetching the user data. We can get this get kind server session function from the SDK. This is to be used inside your server component. It's going to get you a get user function, which you can call and get the user back. This is also going to expose another function called is authenticated, which you can call to see if the user is authenticated or not, and depending on that, show the user profile, or maybe if you want to redirect them back to the signing page. Now, to protect your pages, there's two different ways you can do it. One is to, inside of any component that you have, you can use this function, as I mentioned, to decide if they're authenticated or not. And if they're not, you could use the redirect function from Next Navigation to redirect them back to the sign-in page. The other way to do it is to use a middleware. This is a similar pattern that we've seen on the channel with different providers, different auth providers, where you can use a middleware to protect or decide what pages you want to protect. And if that's the case, you can just export this middleware called auth middleware from the SDK, and you can decide with this config matcher for what paths this middleware should run. In this case, we are running it for every path except our static images and files and favicon. Now here in this app, we're going to create a dashboard page. This is where we're going to send the users once they log in. So our protected page, it's the dashboard page. Now, if you want to protect your API endpoints, it's similar concept. You would use this get kind server session function and call this is authenticated to decide whether or not they're authenticated and how you would want to respond. We're going to also see this inside of our app. So let's just go in the app and see what we're doing here. Now, from a high level, I've added Tailwind to the project. The starter kit was using CSS modules and regular CSS. I prefer Tailwind, so I've added Tailwind to the project. I've also added Prettier for formatting purposes. Now let's just dive right into the code inside of our source. This is where our code actually lives. We have the app router or the app folder and the components. I typically have my components folder inside of the app router, but in this example, I've just brought it out to also see this as a pattern that having our components outside of our app folder or the router. Now inside of our app router, we have the outermost layout, which is the root layout of our app. So let's just see what we're doing over here. Now, this is what you get out of the box pretty much when you install NextJs 13. I've only added this header component and the footer component. Let me just actually show our application over here. So we have this header, we have a footer and a page we're going to see in a second. But inside of our header component, we are actually rendering this logo and also these two links, which is for sign in and sign up. This login link and register link are coming from the SDK, as I mentioned. This is going to take the user to the correct path for them to sign up if this is the first time that they want to register for an account, and or to log in if they've already created an account. And here we're checking to see if they're logged in or not, and if they are, we're going to show this user button. Before we jump into the user button, this is authenticated function is coming from this get kind server session. This is the same function we just saw in the docs coming from the SDK. This is going to expose two functions to you. The first one is the is authenticated. It's a function you call. It returns a boolean to tell you if the user is authenticated or not. And then this get user function, which you can call to get the user object. Now we're going to decide if they're logged in or not, and if they are, we're going to show this user button, and I'm passing in the logged in user and also whether or not they're logged into this user button. Inside of this user button, I'm using some Tailwind CSS or Tailwind components using the headless UI to show this menu. So if we go ahead and actually log in, it is going to take me to the login page where I have the option to log in with an email or Google OAuth. This is the two options that I have enabled for this app, from where if I select my Google account, it's going to log me in and redirect us back to our application's dashboard page. So this is our dashboard page. And from here, I've implemented this user button. This is the same thing that we were looking at. And this user button has this menu drop down, again, using headless UI to show the currently logged in user and a link for them to go to manage their account on the dashboard page. This is the same page, and or to log out. So if I'm on the home page, if I click on the user button, because I'm logged in, first of all, instead of the sign in and sign out, I'm seeing this user button. And from here, I can go to manage account or to the dashboard page, or I can log the user out, which is going to redirect them back to the home page where we started. Now, this is all we had going on inside of our header component. Now let's go back and actually see the dashboard page real quick. Now in here, I'm again using this get kind server session function to get this is authenticated function to see if the user is authenticated or not. And if they're not, I'm going to redirect them back to the API auth login. These are the API endpoints that are exposed with this dynamic path that we set up in the beginning for the kind auth, if you remember over here. So app API auth and kind auth, this is going to expose all the functionality. So if you redirect or send the users to API auth login, this is going to hit your API endpoint, which is then going to take them to the login page hosted on Kind. Now, this is one way of protecting your dashboard page. As I mentioned, you can also implement a middleware. In this example, I'm not using a middleware. So inside of my source directory, there is no middleware. If you wanted to put in a middleware, it should live side by side with your app. So inside of your source, you would have to create a middleware function to decide which pages need to be protected and which pages of your app are going to be public. I didn't use a middleware in this example. I prefer to just check to see if the user is authenticated or not as a per page basis. We're also implementing a similar concept inside of our API. So we have this protected API endpoint from where we're just using this same get kind server session function to see if they're authenticated or not. And if they're not, we're going to send an unauthorized error message. And if they are authenticated, we're going to send their user ID. So right now I'm not authenticated. So if I go ahead to API/protected, it is going to send me an unauthorized error message with a status of 401. If you can see, make this a bit bigger. And if I go back to our application and sign in and try to access that same API endpoint again, this time you can see it sends a hello user with my ID, which shows that using this same function, we can also protect our API endpoints. We also have a public API endpoint, which anyone can access because we are not checking any authentication. It's a wrap for this video, folks. We implemented kind authentication in NextJs 13, specifically in the app router, using their SDK. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you want to see any specific feature implemented using kind authentication, please also leave them down in the comments. I like to extend the app we created in this video. So if there's any specific feature you're interested in seeing implemented in our app, please let me know. Other than that, signing out. Until next time. Bye-bye.